Have you ever wondered how people manage to endure seemingly impossible circumstances without losing their minds or, their identities? Well, in this explainer, we're going to look at an ancient historical document that tackles exactly that. We are unpacking the book of 1 Peter, drawing heavily on an incredible lecture by Dr. David Bauer on inductive Bible study. And we're not just reading this as some dusty ancient religious text. No, we're going to reverse engineer it. Because what Dr. Bauer's analysis reveals is that 1 Peter is actually a masterfully engineered survival guide. It's literally a structural blueprint for an oppressed community that's just desperately trying to hold on to hope. Put yourself directly into the shoes of the original audience for a second. Imagine you're living in the 1st century. You've recently joined a new minority community, and because of this, you are suddenly facing intense hostility from your neighbors, your former friends, maybe even your own family. It is essentially the ancient equivalent of being completely socially canceled, but with literal life or death stakes. This is the real-world problem that 1 Peter is attempting to solve. The text describes their situation not just as a mild disagreement, but as a severe, fiery trial. Listen to how the author puts it. He writes, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal which comes upon you, as though something strange were happening to you." You can really hear the deep empathy there, right? But there's also a lot of gritty realism. The author is looking straight at their pain and saying, look, I know it's a fiery ordeal, but this is exactly what we need to prepare for. This letter is their actual blueprint for resilience in the face of that fire. Okay, so here is our agenda for this explainer. First, context, exiles under fire. Second, the letter's blueprint. Third, cause and effect engine. Fourth, real-world application. And finally, the mirror of Christ. Let's jump right into section 1, context, exiles under fire. Dr. Bauer points out some really fascinating data directly from the text. Think about this, geographic spread for a second. Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. We are talking about a massive area, basically a huge portion of modern-day Turkey. And this definitely wasn't some uniform group. You had a really broad socioeconomic mix, everyone from slaves dealing with overbearing masters to wealthy individuals wearing fine clothing. Crucially, the text suggests these were second-generation, likely Gentile converts. And the irony here is just striking. They are suffering unjust persecution, verbal abuse, and outright hostility, simply because they abandoned what the author calls the passions of their former ignorance and walked away from their former cohort's wild lifestyles. Now, here is a wild twist regarding where the letter claims to be written from. Right at the end, the author says greetings are sent from Babylon. Now, spoiler alert, they weren't actually sitting in ancient Mesopotamia. As Dr. Bauer explains, Babylon was a really common symbolic code word, a siglum, that early Christians used to refer to Rome. And using that specific word perfectly highlights the massive, oppressive imperial context that was just towering over these readers. They're a scattered minority, and Rome is the undeniable superpower, casting a very long, very dark shadow over their everyday lives. So, think about it. How do you unite a group of people who are geographically separated, socioeconomically completely different, and all living under the terrifying shadow of Rome? Well, you give them a new identity. The author brilliantly addresses them right out of the gate as exiles of the dispersion. Even if they are living in the exact same towns where they were born, they are now exiles because their primary allegiance has entirely shifted. This shared, overarching theological identity unites a marginalized community and gives them a powerful framework to understand why they feel so estranged from society. All right, moving right along to section 2, the letter's blueprint. Dr. Bauer outlines the book as being methodically built in 4 very clear steps. First step, you have the salutation, which is that preparatory statement setting up their new identity. Then step 2, this beautifully written section detailing God's mercies. Step 3 takes up the vast majority of the book, and these are the exhortations, basically instructions on how to live. And finally, you have the conclusion. But what we really need to zoom in on here is the massive, fundamental movement that happens between steps 2 and 3. And that brings us to section 3, cause and effect engine. This is where we hit a really deep contrast. The letter begins with the indicative. Now, in grammar, an indicative statement simply declares a fact. It states what is. Verses 3 through 12 contain absolutely 0 commands. None. It is purely foundational. Here is what God has done. Here are your mercies. Here is your destiny. But then the text shifts dramatically to the imperative, the exhortation, the actual commands, how you must act, holiness, love, submission. The author's logic here is actually super profound. Belief fuels action. You must act a certain way in the imperative strictly because of what is fundamentally, unshakably true in the indicative. And the hinge connecting these two realities, it's one single word: therefore. Dr. Bauer points out that 1 Peter 1:13 begins with this absolutely crucial causal conjunction. Because you have this incredible destiny, therefore, gird up your minds, therefore, be sober. It shifts the text entirely away from lofty theological declarations to urgent, incredibly practical survival commands. The theology isn't just nice theory, it is the literal fuel for their resilience. Let's see how this plays out in Section 4, Real-World Application. Following that giant therefore, the author starts off with a general call. Be holy in all your conduct. Don't conform to your former passions. Have sincere love for one another. It's a fantastic mandate, sure, but initially it completely lacks any situational specifics. Like, what does being holy actually look like when your neighbor is actively slandering you or your master is abusing you? Well, the author doesn't leave them hanging with abstract ideas. He moves into something Dr. Bauer calls particularization, which is basically mapping that broad, lofty call to holiness directly onto the nitty-gritty scenarios of everyday life. So general holiness becomes the specific, difficult task of maintaining good conduct among a hostile Gentile society. He addresses societal structures directly, speaking right to servants dealing with harsh masters, and wives and husbands trying to navigate religiously divided homes. He gives very specific instructions on the proper response to persecutors and outlines exactly what humble submission looks like within their own community. He takes the abstract indicative and applies it directly to the very real, very messy imperative of first-century life. But seriously, why? Why bother keeping up this stellar conduct when people are throwing you to the wolves? Dr. Bauer highlights a recurring purpose statement woven throughout the text, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. All these specific situational instructions share a unified overarching purpose. It's not just about surviving quietly in the corner. It's about living such a visible, undeniably good and resilient life in a hostile society that even your oppressors are eventually forced to recognize it. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the Mirror of Christ. So, how does the author give them the strength to actually pull all of this off? He does it by constantly holding up a mirror. He shows these exiles that the destiny of Christians, which yes, currently involves enduring righteous suffering on the way to receiving eternal glory, perfectly mirrors the destiny of Christ himself. Their painful trajectory isn't some random accident. It is the exact same path walked by the founder of their faith. Their suffering suddenly has profound meaning because it aligns them completely with Christ. Now, with all this intense talk of fiery ordeals, abuse, and suffering, you might naturally assume the main command of the book is simply endure, or maybe fight back. But Dr. Bauer points out an incredible grammatical fact. In that very first major exhortation in chapter 1, verse 13, the absolute pivot point of the whole letter, there is only one main verb driving the entire sentence, and that verb is hope. Set your hope fully upon the grace that is coming. Not grit your teeth. Hope. So what we see when we really look closely at the data is that 1 Peter isn't just a random collection of ancient advice. It is a deeply structured masterpiece of grace and resilience. By moving from a shared identity over to a solid foundation of facts, and then into practical real-world applications, it provides a master blueprint. It intimately connects exactly who these exiles are with how they are going to survive the fire. Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to consider for our own lives, regardless of our individual backgrounds. If your daily actions, your responses to stress, your everyday choices are the imperative commands of your life, what is the indicative foundation you are building them upon? What is the unshakable truth you are placing underneath your own therefore? Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope this explainer has given you a fresh perspective on the architecture of resilience. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.